Thanks for joining us today, everyone. Let's get started with our webinar, Communicating Through a Pandemic. A few opening remarks from Jamie Jordry, our conference program chair.
Morning, everyone. I'm Jamie Jodry, so I'm the program chair for the Latornell Steering Committee this year. And on behalf of the committee, Conservation Ontario, and the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you all to the Latornell Leadership Project. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Halifax, where I am currently located, is also known as Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, first signed in 1726. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Please take a moment to think about the history of the place that you're joining us from today. So this is now our third webinar in the Latornell Leadership Series. The webinar series is meant to explore best practices and share knowledge on top of mind subjects like conservation through a land use planning lens, how to ensure inclusion and diversity in the conservation sector, and today's topic, how to communicate during a pandemic. We aim to bring you first-person stories and tactical advice from Latornell's network of past, current, and upcoming conservation leaders. We've been really enjoying the community response to the Latornell Leadership Project, and we really love having a way to engage with our community as the Symposium takes a pause for 2020. If you've missed our first two webinars, you can view the recordings at latornell.ca. And if you haven't already, please keep in touch with us by signing up for our newsletter at latornell.ca. And thanks for joining us with the Latornell Leadership Project. I'd like to turn it over now to the moderator of today's session, Elizabeth Van Horen. Elizabeth is the General Manager and Secretary Treasurer of Kettle Creek Conservation Authority, a position that she's held since 2010 after 8 years as the authority's Public Relations Supervisor. Prior to joining the public sector, Elizabeth was a videographer and a writer for KCCO TV in Kitchener, Ontario. She has a Bachelor of Arts in English and History from Laurier University and a Master of Arts in Journalism. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for choosing Latornell for your ongoing professional development. This webinar is being delivered in partnership with Conservation Areas Workshop and the Watershed Interpreters Network. It will provide an overview of the different ways conservation authorities have adapted during the pandemic to meet the needs of the various audiences they serve. When the World Health Organization declared a pandemic back in March, the impact on face-to-face communications was immediate. And as the lockdown trapped us indoors, the desire for outdoor recreation and education intensified. In the background were people like you, a team of communicators, probably grappling with your own personal struggles, children looking for snacks, sharing an unreliable internet connection with others in your household, and still being counted on to make sense of it all. It didn't help that information was hard to find, varied depending on what source it was coming from, and had probably changed at least once by the time you drafted that news release or webpage update. In those early days, the GMs of Kettle, Catfish, Long Point, and Grand talked weekly. We shared information and ideas, offered solutions, and built off each other's successes. I can't tell you how much I appreciated that collaboration. I hope that you will find today's webinar just as inspiring. And while we can't network over lunch, I hope that we will be able to engage you as much as possible with our speakers and each other. The format of our webinar is 3 presentations, followed by a short discussion of curated and questions from the floor, also known as the Q&A box, as contributed by you. A few housekeeping notes for this morning. First, all of our attendees are muted and you will not be able to speak or come on video. You will find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to ask any of our panelists a question, please type it in the box and press enter to have it posted. If you would include which panelist you would like to address, that would help us as well. You can upvote a question you like by pressing the thumbs up. We will be reviewing the questions and we will have time to pose a few of them to our panelists. Feel free to interact with others in the webinar through the chat box. And to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you are not speaking, and of course, to unmute yourself when you are. This webinar is being recorded so that members or others who are not able to attend will be able to listen in at their leisure. Before I introduce our panelists, let's look at the results of our poll. And it's so great to see in the chat as well, so many of you joining and such a range of experience and communication joining us today. Let's introduce you to our first speakers. Please welcome Tori Fisher and John Mesman. As a record number of visitors flocked to conservation areas during the pandemic, conservation areas required a coordinated response. Tori and John will detail how they work together with partners to rapidly adjust operations and communication. Tori has 13 years of progressive experience working within conservation parks in Ontario and Credit Valley Conservation. She currently sits as co-chair of the Conservation Areas Workshop Planning Committee. John Mesman leads South Nation Conservation's communication and outreach team, and in true CA style, also wears a different hat, leading the management of the authority's park and trail network. He also served as a chair of the Conservation Areas Workshop from 2017 to 2019. Welcome, Tori and John, over to you.
Hello and good morning. Thanks for tuning into our Latornell presentation on communicating through the pandemic. My name is John Mesman. I work at South Nation Conservation. As mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague Tori from Credit Valley. We just recently wrapped up our virtual webinar series for conservation area staff this last week, and we were invited to join the panel today to talk a little bit more on conservation areas operations and how we came together to communicate through this pandemic. I'm sure for most of our audience members today will be most familiar with the important role that conservation areas play in balancing the needs of people and nature. Ontario's conservation areas collectively account for one of the largest land holdings in the province at over 370,000 acres. Within this network of public land is nearly 550 conservation areas, which are accessible to the public. These spaces, as we all know, play a really important environmental, educational, and recreational role in Ontario, and directly contribute to the physical and mental well-being of our communities. Pre-pandemic, our parks collectively welcomed over 8 million visitors each year. Hidden within these natural gems are lakes, rivers, wetlands, sand dunes, beaches, waterfalls, caves, forests, natural heritage sites, you name it, we've probably got it. Our natural spaces are among our best owned assets, perhaps second only to the staff and community members that champion their continued stewardship. We've always done our best to manage these spaces as sustainably as possible while managing them for their desired purpose, to protect and conserve the ecological integrity of these lands, while also sharing them with the world. Many of our conservation areas were acquired to protect and manage sensitive or rare ecosystems, and many of these spaces have been donated to us by families or fundraised through community effort to provide a lasting natural legacy for our donors and future community benefit. All to say, in a business model that's focused on conserving and sharing these spaces, this year was incredibly challenging, but also reinforcing to understand the essential role that public outdoor natural spaces play in the environment, in the economy, and in pandemic recovery. Our presentation will touch on some of the challenges we faced in managing these spaces and those expectations around them, and how we work together to safely share our areas with our people who will continue to rely on access to green space and nature to get through the day, week, or month, and will likely continue to rely on these spaces for many years to come.
Right. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks, John. I just want to take us back a little bit to the beginning when our area closures started to commence. So in the last few weeks of March, they were definitely hectic time for CAs and for all of us. A lot of rapid decision making in response to provincial direction. Public events and outdoor gatherings were canceled for the foreseeable future. And CAs started to close their washrooms and their buildings, switching to more of a passive use model. So the public could still use their trails and their areas, but with no amenities to offer, many of us waived our user fees. And complete area closure was definitely on all of our minds. It seemed inevitable. When it did come to pass, It kind of felt like a domino effect. CAs were one by one closing their gates, all public trails, passive areas, then active areas, one after another. And staff were on the move, basically installing and mending torn down caution tape barriers and snow fencing and chain link and physical barriers, pylon signage. It kind of felt like the Three Little Pigs in a sense, first the tape barricades, then the plastic barricades, then the metal barricades. But visitors huffed and puffed and dismantled or hopped right over area closures anyway. Lots were more compliant, but some were not so much. So now our areas are closed, they're signed, they're gated. And my boss likes to say, signs don't manage people, people manage people. And he's right. Signs are great when you've got acres of property to manage, but we need an enforcement presence to mitigate trespassing. And we also had the additional worry that, someone might hurt themselves. And with gated front entrances to parks, there isn't readily available emergency access for EMS. So we had a responsibility to keep people out of emergency rooms because, even a twisted ankle on a trail is a strain on the system. So we really hope that folks would just stay indoors and understand the risks, and available staff were spreading that message and educating the public.
The pandemic obviously continues to affect us all differently, personally and professionally. And as land managers, as stewards, as Tori mentioned, we were faced with some pretty big problems early in 2020. And with those problems come pretty big park management decisions that aren't always as simple as stay open or close. And while there was great collaboration in the network on how to manage our parks, our jobs, visitor expectations, and COVID, not all of our solutions, which we were pressed to come up with as quickly, effectively, and safely as we could, would work for all of our challenges. And something that's perhaps more challenging to understand is the implication for the solutions that we worked to come up with. Our decisions had big organizational impacts. And while some of them helped create new efficiencies, safety protocols, revenue streams, and business opportunities, many of them also resulted in job losses, layoffs, and loss of critical park revenue streams that really did go a long way to support this work that we, of course, now know is more important than ever. I think this collective did a pretty good job coming together to tackle some of these, issues with, lots of lessons learned along the way. Tori gives a good example of the Three Little Pigs. It's just looking at the evolution of your signs or the evolution of your enforcement tactics. We had some fine tuning to do along the way. There really wasn't a playbook for this year. It's still being written, and there's probably still more chapters to come. And while there wasn't, a one size fits all approach, we still were able to make decisions on, which areas could stay open, which ones needed to stay closed, and where we could refocus our efforts to prepare the sites that we couldn't open right away for unknown or obvious COVID-19 impacts. And while that message in itself was, challenging for a lot of people to understand, it was important for us to continue to communicate that, we, of all people, know that access to our parks and trails is considered essential. People needed our conservation areas, and in many cases, we just needed time to adjust, prepare, and respond to the needs of the community while balancing the needs of the environment and the public health measures in place. As someone who works in communications, I can tell you that every part of our CA business functions received record numbers of inquiries, questions, comments, feedback, and in many cases, demands from our people. And as difficult as some of these interactions and requests were, we knew that we were doing the right thing. Providing safe access was something that everyone was counting on, and we definitely had to do it right. We might have been, among some of the first agencies to open our facilities, but we still needed to collaborate with everyone involved. We needed to work with other trail groups, the province, and more importantly, our municipalities. Like CAs, municipalities have varying levels of staff resource complements, and we're faced with many of the same challenges as us. We needed to work together to ensure we were implementing the same decisions, the same creative solutions, and safe guidelines, and that collectively we could work with our local health authorities to review our safe open and reopen plans. And for many of us, that involves working with several health units or several health authorities to make sure that that consistent message and approach is being implemented effectively. We also need to make sure that our policing and municipal bylaw partners understood our park management plans and shared in the enforcement of our public health measures in place. And what's been interesting to watch, especially when it comes to our conservation areas, is this sense of evolving public expectation. For many of us, we have great annual park holders and regular visitors we've relied on. And while tourism and visitation was always that added benefit in both natural appreciation and education and a revenue stream, many of our spaces weren't prepared for the monumental influx of people and new park users coming to visit as a result of the pandemic. We borrowed this graphic not because of the emphasis on park benefits. I think we're all kind of with the program by now. We borrowed it because of this idea that nature never closes. With most people, families, workers, students turning to their screens this year to accomplish, work, school, play, the need for outdoor experiences and a nature connection was and remains high. Even if it's only a 30-minute walk around the block, it's essential. And wherever you are in the world, nature is close, nature is free of charge, and nature never closes. Even if we are putting up temporary barricades to support those closures, and as Tori mentioned, sometimes those barricades have, a little bit of evolution themselves, nature doesn't close, right? And we've got to be prepared for that. And as concerning and challenging as this was for park enforcement, which includes good communications, we have to take a moment to understand that this pandemic has reignited a love for the outdoors for people all over this province, and for the world for that matter. This pandemic really reintroduced people to their own backyards. And this enthusiasm, which is often challenging for us to manage, does provide us with a unique opportunity to positively influence people's park behavior and help develop a new understanding and appreciation for the environment. The enthusiasm could also be transformed into revenue, which can be used to further support the management of these spaces. But it also helps create new trail members, volunteers, leaders, and local champions. We want our park visitors to share in the stewardship of these spaces.
Yes, we do. And while we do so, when our parks did reopen, I just wanted to speak to some of the challenges that we did face when we initially reopened largely for passive use around stage 1. We weren't offering really any amenities, washrooms, fewer staff, no sales, no rentals, no pavilions, those kind of things, simply parking lots and trail use. And then the visitors came out in droves, as John mentioned. And we ended up seeing reopening in this manner. What we ended up seeing was illegal parking a lot of the time in residential areas nearby our CAs, in illegal parking zones, on the shoulders of busy highways, anywhere visitors could, either because of, unfortunately, sometimes non-compliance, but just because our areas were packed. They were just packed. And a full parking lot didn't deter visitors from finding a spot and coming in anyway. So there was also, unfortunately, a great deal of littering. With closed washroom facilities and little to no maintenance staff, our parks were just spackled with garbage, overflowing garbage bins, trails, beaches, and parking lots, just littered with everything from diapers to fast food waste to, unfortunately, it's sometimes human refuse to sanitary products. Like we couldn't keep up. We really couldn't. It was unprecedented. And what was really neat was to see on social media how many different CAs in Ontario parks started to actually post pictures of the litter and, on Twitter and Facebook, which is pretty rare, I think, to see poignant images of overflowing trash bins and forceful messaging from CAs. But it was a really effective means of accountability that said, hey, we can do better than this. Our parks are valuable. Let's keep them that way. Another thing we saw was just, fewer staff running operations, where we usually have teams of casual and seasonal staff to ensure our parks look as beautiful as they do. Maintenance efforts, they suffered naturally. We also saw overcrowding, of course. Narrow trail systems and trail features like boardwalks can be really hard to maintain social distancing. So you have to be extra vigilant about stepping off trail and giving way in tight spots. Maybe walking your bike, especially on multi-use trails. And these little courtesies, we would find to be a small price to pay for the benefit of having these areas open, but it does take a certain amount of education to get there. And lastly, we learned that, visitors weren't shying away from driving hours to get to one park. And we wanted to discourage long distance travel. Our collective messaging was, please visit the properties closest to you. The others will be here when this passes, whenever it does. But lastly, I just want to add that I really think these trends were heavily influenced by record numbers of new visitors to parks. People who've never been to a conservation area before, never hiked on a trail before. I think trail users, seasoned trail users, are more familiar with terms like leave no trace and share the trail. So we were faced with this balancing act of education and enforcement, like we usually are.
Thanks, Tori. And if I can add anything at all there, it's really just that we needed to protect our own people, our staff, and our visitors. Our facilities and our spaces needed to protect everyone. And to keep people safe, we, kind of had to put everything on the table and do what was best to protect everyone, rethink our operations, and then communicate the result, which did mean new signs, temporary and permanent, infrastructure changes, redirecting trails, and communicating those safe trail use messages through basically every tool and medium available: press releases, social media management, new online tools, web apps, new advertising techniques, and perhaps more importantly, on the ground implementation. Tori hit it, nailed it in the beginning of the presentation. It's people that we needed to rely on. And something that's, maybe a little bit more unconventional for us was also communicating when not to come to our spaces, when to stay home, and different ways for families to enjoy nature at home at a distance. These management decisions obviously came at a financial cost for organizations, but it was something we certainly needed to do. For us at South Nation, we never closed our passive use properties, but we did have to temporarily maintain closures for a few weeks at some of our seasonal areas. And ultimately that meant we couldn't reopen all of our washrooms. We didn't have the manpower to clean all of our outdoor facilities. For us at perhaps a smaller CA, we only have a few people looking after 15 different parks over 5,000 square kilometers. We can't be everywhere at once. We wouldn't have been able to keep our facilities as clean and disinfected as they needed to be. And like Tori mentioned, you get stuck in this cycle of maintaining instead of improving, right? With all the garbage, all the masks, you name it, on the ground. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to keep these areas safe and clean. But it did mean we could, when it was safe and reasonable to do so, rent portable washrooms and hire a contractor to clean and inspect them regularly, and then post signs to let users know when and how are they being cleaned and how to provide them with resources to keep themselves safe, which includes hand washing and disinfecting, but also information. And information is quite a powerful tool, especially when effectively delivered and communicated. Something that's fundamental in both the decision-making and the implementation and enforcement of our business and park openings is communications. It means we have to be open, honest, and transparent. It takes more than just putting up a sign. It means that people need to have access to all of the information necessary to make good, well-rounded, and informed decisions that will protect themselves and their families.
Very true. I think one of the most interesting aspects from this pandemic has been the increased expectation of communications from CAs. There's been a huge increase in phone calls and emails from the public. I can't tell you how many times I answered the question, is your park open? That one phone call alone. What was interesting about this is a lot of those phone calls were compliance related. People just didn't know what they could or could not do. I mean, I don't blame them. It's a mix of, like I said, new park visitation, but it's also the fact that it's really hard to navigate between provincial parks, national parks, conservation areas, private areas. Everyone's doing things a little differently. So where it's often easy for most people to just ask or do and not ask, I think these calls weren't such a bad thing. It was just time consuming. So social media interactions definitely increased, which meant our relationships with our communications and marketing teams became extra vital for consistent messaging. We needed to really share information between the two of us, as calls spilled over from head office to parks to, everywhere in between. And there were more complaints as well. Visitors policing other visitors, complaints of litter or unsightly trail conditions. Everyone's got a suggestion for you to improve those kind of things. And and even residents who rightfully were upset that their residential roadways were full of park visitors in their vehicles. We also saw a great deal of regular park users feeling that their spaces were being overwhelmed. Even small underused areas were packed full of visitors. And CAs are lucky to have a large membership base, or friends of programs, or just even people who really care about the parks in their own backyard, because that's where they walk their dog every single day. So it's not hard to understand that when they can't walk Daisy because she'll be, you'll be elbow to elbow with several other 100 trail visitors, they're going to speak up. So we needed to be prepared and available for those kinds of questions and inquiries.
And we tossed this slide in just to, kind of reinforce some of those things that Tori just shared. And I think we'll, largely be familiar with most of them. We've built most of our, business functions around good, reliable customer service. And like we said, I mean, every business function was being hit by this increased demand and expectation around access to information. While we've always, received those park-related questions, I honestly could not have anticipated the level of, continued sustained effort that was required to keep pace with our visitor expectations. And like Tori said, at least most of them were compliance related, right? But we can also, easily understand where it's coming from and where the, influx of interested park visitors also stems from. When spaces close, those closures create a sense of scarcity and appeal for those that remain. There's also a lack of alternatives, not just in outdoor spaces in parks, but also recreational and educational activities. The outdoors is recognized as one of the, few places with a reasonable expectation of safety from COVID. And while not all social media channels are, created or used equally, most people rely on it for a source of information. And even though that information is sometimes, toxic, it's still our jobs to communicate good, effective messages. And ultimately, wherever you live, you'll know that everyone, whether everyone's at work, home, or in a lockdown, there is a big lack of green space in urban areas, and people do, need somewhere to go. My last point here is that people obviously have found a lot of time during the pandemic, whether it's to message somebody about, all the crazy things that their neighbor's doing, or how they think someone might be harming the environment, or, to message us and say, why is all this garbage on the trails? Or, also to reach out and say, thanks for all the work that you guys are doing to keep our parks open and safe. We really just wanted to send along a note to say thank you. And I can honestly say, at least in my own job, I've seen these messages in all shapes, sizes, and forms. We needed to engage in some good online messaging and work with our media outlets to communicate that message that we were trying to deliver. But we also, needed to update signs throughout the entire province, and managing sign pollution isn't always easy. I don't know, Tori, if you can walk us through some examples, maybe. Oh, Tori, I think you're muted, sorry.
Totally muted. Hi. Yeah, so I feel like it's funny. We're so used to seeing these signs now. Be smart, stay 6 feet apart is barely something even eye-catching anymore. Capacities in washrooms, arrows on the ground, please sanitize, stay apart. All CAs really had to come up with their own version of these types of things. But signs can't answer, every question. I think it was also important for signage to direct our visitors to individual websites, so that visitors might take it upon themselves to educate and familiarize with guidelines and capacity restrictions, cashless payment methods, trail closures, and so on. We also needed creative solutions for areas that were rather confined in parks. So Credit Valley, for instance, tried some one-way trails that ended up working quite well for us in some of those narrow trail features. And another interesting signing campaign I saw become more common in CAs was just some variation of please respect these areas. This is what good trail etiquette looks like. Just a gentle reminder, pack out your trash, keep your dogs on a leash, yield on busy trailways, and don't gather in big groups. So, if you practice all these good measures together, we'll have a good time.
Tori and John, are you almost done the presentation where we just want to keep on time?
Of course, yeah. I think we've got 3
up?
slides left. And just to give us a, a quick example on some of those mass communication techniques, we've seen them, some great added benefit. We've seen some of those good messages online where, media outlets, municipalities, and special interest groups are coming to our defense of those trail etiquette techniques, really trying to remind and reinforce people that, please be respectful. We want these spaces to stay open. And on the flip side of that, we also see, the result of when mass communication didn't work in our favor. We all, I think, will likely trust in our city and block TO, maybe not professionally as a park manager, but likely as a person to find a good hidden gem or good spot to visit. We do rely on these sorts of publications to get us, to where we need to be. But when something like this happens, a space like Bell Fountain can't accommodate the thousands and thousands of visitors flocking out of Toronto to get some of those great views and photos. And this is the view of the street just outside, which hopefully gives us a good segue, Tori, to make a comment on reservation systems.
Yeah, which is why we employed them at CBC. So a few CAs did look to day use visitation by reservation only. So this really gave us an additional ability to have users pledge or consent to park rules online, so they arrive with a sense of expectation of health and safety measures. For example, Hamilton Region, Halton, and CBC all employed reservation systems. So entry needed to be reserved and paid for ahead of time, ahead of arrival on site, which gave groups basically a start and an end time to their stay and helped keep the visitation moving. And where it worked really well was a contactless payment option. It limited the amount of time that staff needed to interact face-to-face with customers. And it gave visitors a more intimate experience of the park that they were competing, so they weren't competing for space. It also guaranteed a parking spot. So the technology itself was challenging to implement mid-pandemic, but it surely made things a lot more manageable. And I think we'll be using it for years to come.
Tori and John, unfortunately, we're running really short on time, so I'm gonna cut it off there. There's lots of great questions coming in on the Q&A, and so I'd really encourage our participants to give thumbs up to those questions that we want to come back to Tori and John later with at the end of the webinar. But due to timing, and our next presenter is Hassan Bassett from Conservation Ontario. From Conservation Halton. Hassan is a very busy guy these days, and he's here this morning to demonstrate how Conservation Halton is using technology to bring back responsible and equitable access to nature. So while Hassan is loading his slides deck, again, just encouraging to get those questions in from the chat and thumbs up those ones that you want to come back to the panelists on. Okay, Hassan, over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. I'm assuming you can see my screen and hear me. So yes, as Elizabeth mentioned, it's been very hectic for a lot of CAs with all the changes to the Conservation Authorities Act, but if anything, it's underscored in our minds the importance of the good work we do, and really the fact that we need to communicate always better, not just during a pandemic. So, the previous presenters certainly did an exceptional job of talking a lot about the various challenges and perceptions and the various agencies to work with, and the importance of CAs in the early days collaborating amongst themselves and with their municipalities and health departments. So what I'm going to do is sort of give you maybe more of a use case on how CH or Conservation Halton tackled the problem through technology, but more importantly, how we put communication and customer experience at the center of our solution, and not just once the solution had been rolled out, but actually we put customer experience at the center of everything the day we closed our parks. And so, simple things like, okay, well, we're going to open, but we didn't feel it was acceptable to have somebody drive in from 20, 30, 40 kilometers or 20, 30, 40 minutes and find that there's there's a sign outside the park that says it's closed now. Those are the types of things that I mean when I talk about customer experience. You put yourself in their shoes and try and see how you would feel if you were to find out something about a product you were going to buy or engage with. And so while a lot of chaos was acceptable given the disruption caused by the pandemic, we really focused on how can we minimize that in every way, because everybody was feeling a sense of frustration with so many things they were doing in their lives or trying to do. And at CH, we always believe that we don't want to add to that. So, some of these images were shared in just the previous presentation. The two on the left, that was the day we decided to close our parks on March 21st. It was a really nice, as you can see from the pictures, sunny, bright, warm Saturday afternoon. And keep in mind that day, not a lot of, it was still disruptive, things were closing and opening, and the province was announcing various things and the municipalities were doing various things, but there wasn't a lockdown, there wasn't a closure. So in those early days, I think the responsibility was still with a lot of businesses to figure out what they wanted to do. And so we made the decision on that Saturday afternoon to close the parks right then. Would it have been easier to wait 5 or 6 hours when everybody would have left in the evening? Yes. Would it have been easier to wait till Monday morning? Of course. But we didn't feel that was the right thing to do. And the reason for that was we do care about our visitors and their experience. And this was, a virus that can be transmitted when you're in close proximity to people. And when we looked at those pictures coming across from our Rangers team, we thought part of our responsibility keeping people safe in our parks extends to what's going on here with the pandemic. So we did it the hard way. We emptied our parks, all 8,000 acres, in the middle of a Saturday afternoon, and then we closed them for quite a long time with those fences and everything. And I think it was Tori who mentioned it. We had to go to that level. And even with the fences, we saw lots of bad behavior. And yes, of course, it was a small percentage, but it was a terrible time, to be in as a park operator, a landowner, because at the end of the day, people were trespassing. They weren't respecting your property. They weren't respecting your rules. And so those 2 or 3 weeks where we had the chain link fences and we had, police and local bylaw enforcement and our own rangers handing out hundreds and hundreds of tickets were amongst the most stressful and infuriating times, in my career. Maybe that's been topped by the recent CA Act, but as of then, that time really sucked, because you don't want to rely on enforcement, but people simply weren't respecting the chain link fences. Even they were going around and doing all of this. So we knew we wanted to get out of that. We also knew that the pandemic in some shape or form was going to be with us for at least 12 to 18 months, if not longer. And that it was going to throw various curveballs at us, that there would be a wave and then a second wave and things would slow down and maybe we'd open. And that's exactly how it's played out. And so, we decided that very night, March 21st, the senior team had a meeting, virtual, of course, Saturday night, everybody at their kitchen table after dinner to say, okay, let's talk about reopening. And we agreed on a number of principles that we felt were important for us. One, that we were going to open in a way that really looked at the customer experience, not just in the parks, but being able to access the parks, because we knew there was going to be some sort of limitations put on how we open. The second principle was that it had to be equitable. And the reason I mention that is, a lot of municipalities use the tools that they had at their disposal. And so I'm not faulting them, but things like, we'll close the parking lots, but the parks will stay open. Well, that's great if you live next to a park, if you live next to the lakeshore. But certain types of demographics live in areas that have access to nature and shorelines. I mean, there's lots of studies that show show that, and it's not really equitable. How is it equitable to somebody living in a housing block, a block of flats or something? And so we thought, that was going to be important for us. And the third thing we looked at was that we were going to manage the disruption that was going to come, and somehow figure out a way where the user experience and our operational capacity wouldn't be impacted if tomorrow, gathering capacities changed or whatever happened. So it had to be a dynamic system that we could dial up and down as we went along. So when we closed that day, we sent out a very honest notification to all our park, everybody on our database, basically lots of members and others, and we used the media as well. And we said, look, we're not happy about closing, but we promise we're going to open. And the reason I think we put that in there is to say we're the people who've been always telling you to get out in nature, and now when we feel you need it the most, we've taken it away, and it's not sitting well with us. But be patient, and we'll work on something. And we started working almost the next day, developing our own in-house system, working with a Canadian startup that brought in the software engineers and the coders, if you will. And then we worked on it because, well, we know our parks, we know the facilities, we know what a gatehouse looks like, we know what lineups look like, we know what questions people have. We know how they interact with trail maps and what questions they ask when they enter. So again, it's bringing that user experience. And we also did a lot of physical upgrades to our park. So over the course of 4 or 5 weeks in April, we installed electronic gates at all the parks. So a lot of infrastructure had to be upgraded. A lot of conservation areas are located where you have very poor Wi-Fi signal. So that was part of it. Talking to Rogers and Bell and upgrading all of that, because you have to enable yourself to be able to take advantage of technology. So that's sort of the infrastructure that upgrades, that we paid a lot of attention to. And what we've got now is a fully integrated system. Well, we've had it since May, where you make a reservation before you leave your house. And we have these integrated license plate scanners embedded in the roadway as you drive up to the gatehouse. When you make your reservation, you enter your license plate. So as you're driving up to the gatehouse, the scanner scans your license plate, validates your reservation, and by the time you show up to the gate automatically opens. And that was an objective as well, because we were going to improve things. And I remember the staff asking me, well, our average is about 30 to 45 seconds of interaction at the gatehouse during a normal day. We'll try and cut it in half. And I kind of said, why don't we aim for 0? And so that's what we've been able to achieve. I mean, it's not quite 0 because people still stop and ask if we're sure they can go in. And that takes a little bit of time and education to do that, but we're very happy with the way the technology worked. Now, the system at its back end, and we're bringing in smart AI algorithms now, where it's learning from the data, and we can basically think about it as inventory. You can put out 30 boxes of cereal on your aisle in your store, or you can put out 8. And we looked at our entire parks. We did a lot of calculation on distancing and capacities of each trail and parking lot capacity, and we came up with numbers that we felt would ensure good physical distancing and a quality experience. And that's the inventory that's available for each park on any given day. That inventory can be dialed down or up very quickly depending on how things are going. And then we study the data a lot. Who's arriving late? What are the patterns? Is 20 minutes working? Is it not? So all of that was developed in-house and went into it. And all of that really enabled a smooth customer experience where people have been really thrilled with what we've offered. But let's go back to when we closed and we started to communicate to people. So I think we even communicated this very image to them to say, we're working in phases here. And that when we open in a few short weeks, we are going to change 50 years of learned behavior. And that's essentially what we were doing. People are not used to coming to a conservation area by making a reservation. They're not used to limiting it to 2 hours. They're not used to actually booking a spot on the beach. Some of the early images of bad behavior, or not even early, late in the summer, those were images of beaches in Toronto and other areas. And we opened Kelso Beach, which is quite popular for visitors, but it was with reservation stops. And, as you walk through the boardwalk, there was a scanner that scanned, made sure you had your reservation, and then off you went to the beach. So, all technology ultimately comes down to how well it's designed for the customer to be able to use, and how well you communicate, all of the aspects of that technology. And so communication was very important for us, because we were going to use this opportunity, this crisis, to basically change how we were going to have people access nature moving forward. And that may not be a need for a lot of park operators or conservation authorities. It is for us, because our parks are extremely popular, as they are with a lot of CAs. And, any warm, crisp fall day, you could have 45-minute lineups on municipal roads and provincial roads of people waiting to get in. And this year we've had absolutely no lineups because of this reservation system. We also used a lot of traditional media, both owned and earned media. Our own social media reach is quite extensive, but we really focused on how we were going to curate the messages. It had to be cohesive, it had to tell a story, and it had to keep, people engaged that we were working on it. A very small example of how we kept people engaged was when we, in early April, as we started to pilot this technology, the code was being developed, and simple things like what kind of cameras would work, in a parking or on a driveway in a conservation area. So I think we went through like 8 or 9 different cameras. Some would read the plates in the morning, not in the afternoon when the sun was shining on them. Some wouldn't read it if you had those plastic covers on them. None of the cameras read the blue license plates. So we had to do a lot of pilots, and even, should we allow 20 cars every 10 minutes? Should we allow 1 car every 2 minutes? What should the turnaround time be? All of that had to be piloted. And what we did was we would send out an email to all 10, 15,000 of our subscribers to say, we're doing a pilot on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Here's a list. If you can make it, it's just to train our system, and so people would sign up for that. They were actual customers. They were taking part in the experiment. And I think a lot of people, and the reason we did that, because we could have just done it through invitations, we could have just done it with staff. It was actually part of our engagement strategy to show people that A, we were working to open them safely, and B, that when they were going to open, it was going to be different. I won't read this, but there was certainly a lot of direct messaging in the early days, such as, unfortunately, while most people have been very responsible, some have demonstrated a complete disregard for health advice we must follow. This leaves us no choice but to close. So, when we closed, we were very direct. And then as we pivoted to trying to, start to introduce the idea of how we were going to open, again, that was very personalized communication. We then launched a campaign which was really well received, and it was a pledge, because we wanted to sort of say, we're all in this together now, and let's not talk about rules, let's not talk about guidelines. We need to take a pledge here, and it was, I pledge that I will arrive on time and leave on time so that others can enjoy the park. Again, that sense of collective. I pledge to stick to the right when others are approaching, and pass on the left, again, about others and the fact that we're all in this together, that I'm in good health and do not have any symptoms. Again, these were early days. Obviously, the language around COVID screening kept morphing as public health advice kept changing or improving. I think you saw one of these images in the previous presentation. So lots of infographics, trying to make it as simple as possible for people Things like, let people pass safely. That was one of the things. Again, you've heard, and you probably continue to hear from other speakers as well, a lot of first-time users, and that's fantastic. Sometimes people look down upon them and say, oh, well, we've been using these conservation areas for decades and we know how to do it. Now you got all these people from Vaughan and Richmond Hill coming all the way to Halton. Well, that's fantastic. Great. There's a first time for everybody. That goes back to that equitable access. So that education piece was good. We had some issues with garbage, not a lot, certainly not, compared to some of the other CAs. And I don't know what the reason behind it is. There are probably two. One, there was a definite spike in the early days, and we just said, then let's pick it up even faster, because I'm sure you've all heard that classic case study now in New York City where they just decided to get rid of all graffiti almost overnight, and it reduced crime. It was sort of that sort of approach where if other people see garbage, then it becomes acceptable. So rather than just complain that too many people throwing garbage, we decided to do our part as well and double, triple, quadruple our rounds along with messaging. And eventually, within the span of a week or two, that problem went away, and we're very happy with that. Again, the newsletter we sent to our subscribers, we kept them informed. There were various, times where we talked to them. I owned a lot of the messaging personally, because to bring that tone to say an entire organization is worried about getting you back out very, very quickly. And we were also very upfront to say, look, for Halton anyway, and I know for other CAs as well, only about 28% of our budget comes from municipal levy. 100% of our parks have always been self-supporting, which means we're a high risk, high reward type of operation when it comes to our parks. So when we closed in March, we operate, the province's third busiest ski operation. We had to cancel all March break lessons, issue refunds, cancel maple syrup. By the end of March, just in the first 10 days of the pandemic, we were down $2.5 million in revenue. Because of the refunds and the cancellations. And we were very honest in our communication to say, we're just like any mid-sized business. We don't have money to pay our staff and we're going to lay them off. So if you think we're not working hard enough, we care about you, but we really also care about our own staff. And the faster we can open, the faster we can get our people back to work. And that honesty was there, and people really respected that. There were campaigns to donate to the Conservation Authority. I couldn't be prouder of how the pandemic evolved from the ugliness of trying to get people to respect boundaries around your property to just the show of support for the Conservation Authority. And again, I've mentioned some of these. We did and continue to do extensive surveys in our parks, daily surveys when we opened up the reservation system. Then they went down to weekly. And that data was invaluable. So every day, or every week, you would get 10, 15, 20,000 people coming to our parks. We would ask them very simple questions, and those questions would change sometimes daily or weekly, because it was a new system, and we wanted to know what was frustrating people. And we learned so much from that. I think the first 10 or 12 weeks of this new system, there were updates being issued to the system every night. It's not because we got it wrong when we launched it, it worked. But again, that user experience was very important for us. Simple things like, well, I can't see this, it'd be better if I could see that. If I'm coming from here, it doesn't really work for me. Would it, I don't know your parks. And so when you send me the reservation, can you also send me a link to the trail map? Little things like that. The marketing and communications team and the park operations team would go over the surveys on a nightly basis. And then, at the end of the week, looking at the data, making sure there's enough there, they would issue updates to the coders, and then they would change their system. And I think a lot of people commented back to us to say, we always fill out surveys for all sorts of brands and experiences. We never really see the improvement. You guys are doing it in real time. And again, it makes good operational sense, but it makes even better customer engagement sense if you can do that. So again, communication early, during, after, and it continues even now. We're looking to open a massive ski operation, hopefully in a couple of weeks, using the same in-house system, which has now been just taken to the next level. to be able to help us manage our ski operations, including rentals and lessons and day tickets and lift capacities and all of that stuff. So our communication on that front continues. So that's it for my presentation. I'll turn it back over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Hassan. That last bit of information I think is helpful to some of the participants online. They were asking whether or not you take public opinion survey processes and how that changed during the pandemic. So that was great to hear that feedback. You've had a great response to this technology as well. Do you think that you'll continue with it after the pandemic, when life hopefully gets back to a little bit more normal?
Yes, absolutely. This is here to stay forever. So given the volume and quite frankly, Elizabeth, and I mentioned this earlier, we're like a mid-sized business. We need to generate revenues if we're to continue to offer these types of experiences. And so what we've been able to do is have way more visitation because we've been able to manage that capacity. And while when you didn't have a reservation, maybe a Saturday afternoon walk in the parks was the preferred time for 80% of the people wanting to come out to a park that day. Well, now they can just log on and say, well, Saturday afternoon's not available, but 11 a.m. is. Well, I'll just shift lunchtime with the kids or whatever, but I'll go at 11. And so we've been able to, spread that capacity across the day and also across our parks. People have been customers of ours for a decade and have only ever gone to one park, and now they can see, oh, well, I can't go hiking at Kelso. I guess I'll go check out Hilton Falls, and then they fall in love with Hilton Falls. So be able to spread the capacity throughout the day across the network. Our revenues have been fantastic. The user experience has been fantastic. It works. We're going to continue to tweak it. It's just I was interviewed on CBC Radio, the day we closed all of this, or TV or something. And then when we launched the reservation system, I was interviewed on maybe 10:10 News in the Morning. And the host right away said, and it was 7 a.m., and I'm not sharp at all at 7 a.m. And the first question was, way to go, Hassan, you've just taken away the spontaneity of going out for a walk in nature. And I said, yeah, but I've given you certainty, and that's not a bad thing in the middle of a pandemic. Certainty that I think, as the previous speaker said, you're not going to be fighting for a parking spot. You're not going to be jammed up at trailheads. Who wants to pack the kids in a car, drive 20, 30 minutes, and fight for a parking spot to get out into nature? So it just makes sense for us. It's worked well, and I think we'll stick with it.
Great. Hassan, thank you for leading by example, and certainly kudos to your team. They put in the effort into a great product that I think a lot of us will be looking at in the future to see if we can adapt it to our own programs and services. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Our final presenters this morning are Karen Bromberg and William Sorley. Karen and William will be presenting on how CAs have continued to provide effective watershed education programs during the current pandemic. Karen and William are both Ontario certified teachers and members of the Watershed Interpreters Network. Karen coordinates programs for youth to learn about nature and the environment through stewardship and restoration projects at Credit Valley Conservation as their senior program coordinator for community outreach. Karen is joined today by William, an education coordinator at Toronto and Region Conservation. He has taught nature-based program throughout the region of Peel for the last 3.5 years. Karen and William, thank you for joining us today. I will ask you to keep your presentation tight because we want to open it up to questions at the end for all the panelists. Thank you.
You're welcome. We're going to do our best to get things started here. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to share how educators have been adapting through the pandemic, and thank you for your interest in our work. Today, I'll provide an introduction, a little bit of an overview of who we are, some case studies that will showcase how CA education staff and programs have been adapting. Of course, we can't talk about everything today due to limited time. And then I'm going to throw it to Will, who's in the field, so to speak. He works at TRCA, and he's going to share some of their techniques and technology that they're using to continue to engage their audience. And then I'll share some takeaway themes and reflections.
So what is WIN, or Watershed Interpreters Network? This network connects teachers, educators, and interpreters that work at conservation authorities across Ontario. It all started as a small workshop called Rekindle the Sparks in 1994. And in 2008, it expanded to include all conservation authorities as WIN. It has evolved to include 2 recognition awards, a Facebook group, and a newsletter for year-round networking. And today there are 34 of the 36 conservation authorities that deliver environmental education programming to almost 380,000 students each year. These staff are often certified teachers that manage, deliver, and run outdoor and environmental education and watershed education programming. We operate 38 nature interpretive centers, 20 of which are permanent and year-round, and over 3,695 schools participate in these programs each year. As CA educators, we are uniquely poised to tap into the scientific information and data collected by our colleagues at CAs that are ecologists, engineers, and planners to communicate current local trends in nature in a way that is palatable to diverse audiences. Education staff work with elementary and secondary students, but also newcomers to Canada. We engage businesses, corporate groups, and landowners, and we offer hands-on volunteer stewardship projects. And before the pandemic, we worked in schools and in schoolyards, at CA parks, in neighborhood parks, and other community facilities. But as we all know, since March 2020, things started to look a little bit different. Many of our CAs have had to pivot, and that's probably the word of the year, you've heard it a few times today, to continue engaging our clientele. While the pandemic unfolds and some of our aspects of life have been put on pause, more important issues, or just as equally important issues, I should say, like climate change, biodiversity, habitat loss, and local water management issues continue to need attention and understanding. So I'll share a little bit about how we've been approaching during the pandemic. As an early response to the pandemic, Lake Simcoe CA took to social media. They created a Facebook group called Outdoor Learning with LSRCA, and they have over 1,142 members and followers. Some are local, most are local, but some are even from other countries. Before the pandemic, many CAs had videos on YouTube like CVC's hashtag Learn with CVC to engage students and teachers and families. So really, it was just a matter of tapping into these resources to share with our audiences and remind people of where to find these videos as resources. Emily February from Catfish Creek, or more locally known as Ranger M, started making some homemade movies and activities that teachers and parents could do with their kids around the house or in the backyard to keep engaged and outside, and to help them find ways to nurture nature at home. Ranger M soon realized she could have a broader reach and contacted a friend at Rogers TV London to help increase her audience reach and improve the editing of the videos. Since then, Learn with Ranger M has had 6 live episodes featuring several different community partners that span topics from agriculture to soils to species at risk, and all episodes can be found on YouTube on the Rogers TV channel. Here's a short clip of what Ranger M is all about. I'm going to pass things over to Mario to play the video.
This is the organic layer. Super handy for our fields and our organic farming is that those birds produce a lot of poo. So chicken manure is really great.
So today I actually have a friend that's going to join me on my hike.
I am a hiker. I also volunteer for Catfish Creek.
Dip netting is just using a big sturdy net, getting deep down into the mud, and then searching through the mud looking for these benthic macroinvertebrates. Yarmouth is one of the best examples of what conservation authorities and hard work can do for restoring and now working towards conserving and managing a local ecosystem. Hi everyone, my name's Ranger M, and I work at Catfish Creek Conservation Authority. I'm the community outreach technician, and that means I do a lot of this, chatting about all things nature and conservation with kids, adults, teachers, everyone. I love to knowledge share, and that's just what I'm going to do with you. So come on, let's go learn with Ranger M.
All right, thanks, Mario. Okay, one of the other tactics that we used was changing things up to more virtual and online. And each year, Kettle Creek Conservation Authority hosts the Carolinian Forest Festival. This year, the festival was held virtually in October. Grade 6 and 7 teachers accessed 9 videos related to the Carolinian Life Zone, forest ecology, biodiversity, and species at risk. Teachers were provided with follow-up activities, and the festival culminated with a virtual field trip to the Long Point Bird Observatory in partnership with Birds Canada. Some highlights include 146 teachers and their classes participating in the field trip, over 2,000 visits to the webpage, and over 1,000 video views. This presentation will be shared with you later, so you'll have access to the links. Early on in the pandemic, St. Clair Conservation Area also saw an opportunity to support teachers in their new endeavor of teaching students online. Staff created virtual field trips, curriculum-connected lessons for K to 8, a secondary lesson, and some in French. They had over 15,000 views between April and June. Staff worked with teachers and the tools that they were already using, like Google Slides, to co-develop, publish, stop publishing to control access, and embed YouTube videos. They also found Screencastify to be useful while teaching via video. The virtual field trips are now being offered to schools via a subscription process, and they're being used as a revenue-generating resource. Pre-pandemic, many CAs offered online learning tools and resources, but since the beginning of the pandemic, we've also amped up these resources. Lake Simcoe and CBC have added more content, created lesson plans, and added resource packages for teachers that are curriculum linked to things like literacy and math for teachers. And again, these links can be shared with you later. Asaba Bayfield offered an outdoor school with social distancing and COVID protocols in place. This was a weekly program for children aged 9 to 13, and it ran in October and November. They were so popular that they're going to be running it again in the new year and in the spring of 2021. Upper Thames Conservation Authority used the early days of the pandemic to research and develop and consult about their vision for Wildwood Nature School. They built stronger relationships with park staff that built their nature school area and that took their program registrations. They used the pandemic as an opportunity to reconnect with themselves as educators and our roots as educators. Some CA staff sent staff to schools for outdoor contactless environmental programming like Lake Simcoe, where they engaged 47 grade 4 classes where they spent 100 minutes outside learning about habitats and communities. St. Clair CA also developed SOPs to minimize equipment sharing and enhance cleaning protocols to allow safe programming in schoolyards and nearby parks. Their fall programming engaged 2,700 students in 23 schoolyards across the watershed. And Halton CA ran their summer day camp program for small bubble groups, engaging 745 participants. And this bubble model was also used to deliver 85 nature programs at 2 Halton parks. So now I'm going to pass it over to Will in the field, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Can you hear me here, Karen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, everybody. So super excited to be here today. My name is William Sorley. I am an educator, a part of the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. And I'm actually here just in my backyard. And today I'm just going to talk a bit about what TRCA has done. And we've done a whole bunch of different things, but at the beginning of the pandemic, what we really did was we started to digitize all of our programs, and especially our education programs when I'm talking about all of our in-classroom handouts we put online and were available for teachers through Google Slides or a fillable PDF. Now, we also realize that, especially for myself, because I'm an educator, I go into classes and actually deliver programs there. That's not going to happen with COVID. So what can we do to get back into the classroom? Well, like many other CAs and other organizations, we did it virtually. And, you know, right now, this is something that I just do with another class. I take them into maybe my local CA if it has good 3G reception, or just my backyard here as I am on Wi-Fi. And we realize that, okay, we can do these smaller personalized videos or education, but we can also do a larger one such as a live. And these lives were for a general audience. We first started on Facebook Live. Now we did that because we wanted to react as quickly as we could to the ongoing pandemic. And we put them on Facebook, but when we started to realize, once we got closer to the school year, that it might not be as accessible for teachers. So that's when we started to realize, okay, let's change to YouTube. And that's where we are now. And today is we are using YouTube Live as our way to communicate with teachers as a general audience. Now, what I'm talking to you on right now, what I'm going to be focusing on is just some of the tech that we use in regards to how to enhance the program. Because we started to create all of these virtual programs, but then we realized, well, how do we better them? Because our video and our audio is something we have to really consider. I've already mentioned one thing, and talking about earlier in regards to Wi-Fi or internet, we need to make sure it's strong. And you know, when we were doing some test runs for this, I was at one of our conservation areas, Albion Hills, and it's not the greatest in regards to our internet. So making sure that if it's, you know, if I'm using internet, it's good, or our 3G network, it's also good. But what are some things? Because our lives, those are some larger experiences for the community as a whole, or teachers. What can we do? Well, the way to start out is something pretty simple of what we have, and I'm just going to change the camera over here, is something called a gimbal. And this is really where we started and where we are with a lot of our virtual teachings, is a gimbal. So you can see it here, you can see my phone, and I move it side to side. It stabilizes the phone, so it's not an earthquake when you're watching it. It's something really important. Now, another thing that we had to consider with this was actually the phone itself. We're not using flip phones. We're not using the old slidey Blackberries. Something newer, more up to date, so it has a better camera and also a better mic. Now, these two are basically the basic package, what I have right here. Our gimbal, and the one I have is called an Osmo Mobile 3. So it's specifically for a phone, and I can do lives. I can also do virtual in-class programming, maybe if it's with a class or maybe if it's with another community. So this is what we have in regards to our basic package. Now, of course, depending on what your needs are, the technology also changes because there's an overwhelming amount of tech that there is out there. Now, I'm just going to go through a couple of things that I have here that have helped us succeed in our endeavors. Now, when I think about this, it's more specifically about our lives, so our larger YouTube lives, and also our in-classroom visits virtually. So I'm just going to change back my camera here. Now, I'm talking to you actually with a lapel mic. And what that is just a microphone, a wireless microphone that attaches to my jacket here. And it looks just like this one here. Now, there's a whole bunch of things. You can see my computer over here. Our wireless microphones right here. Lapel mics, great. Now, the reason why we wanted wireless lapel mics was to, one, increase our audio quality. So if it's a really windy day, everyone can still hear us. And also, my last live that I did with one of my colleagues, Raya, her and I were socially distanced. We were about 150 feet away from the computer, and we could still be heard crystal clear. And that was really important for myself and also our viewers, because we're not having the hassle of yelling at the camera and making sure they can hear us. So what we have here is just our microphone. And this little box just talks to this and puts it into my computer. It's really the basic way. But the reason why we got this microphone right here is because we can actually plug it into a larger speaker system. So hopefully after the pandemic, we can use it further in different ways. Now, I mentioned video quality is also something really important. Now, what I have you on here is actually a video camera. Or if I wanted to, I could put you on a DSLR camera, which is really handy too. Because having a sharper image, especially if I'm, standing still and I'm in a fixed location, is important. And what we use for this is actually something called a cam link. Now, what this little thing does is it actually connects my camera here to my computer and allows it to be used basically as a webcam, which is really neat. And it allows us to have a crisper image and also different things that we can enhance on. We've used this to use our microscope during one of our lives. So I can show a microscope to the class I'm teaching virtually. Another really neat trick or tool that I use within classrooms prior to COVID and even during this pandemic is actually an item called a Zoomie. It's a small little USB microscope that's really handy. You just plug it into your computer and it acts just like a video camera. Now, one neat thing too, as I have a tripod that has a camera, is just these little gadgets. They just hold your phone onto the tripod so it's nice and stable. Because we do lots of live videos, but we also do some pre-recorded videos too. For example, if our service isn't the greatest in one of our areas, we can still have access to doing videos that are pre-recorded and then we upload them later. Because no, we're not going to do everything live. And of course, some people aren't as comfortable doing that too. Now, the last thing I want to talk a bit about is we have all this hardware too, is a bit about software. Now, there are lots of different types of software to put everything together, but I and the TRCA use something specifically for our virtual visits and also our lives. It's something called Streamlabs. Now, what this is just a program that allows me to use different tools for a virtual camera. So right now I have you on my camcorder here, but I can also pull up pictures or images over top of that. So last week I was talking about microplastics. I brought up here just an earlier article that happened. I can bring up the worksheet that we created. I can bring up maybe pictures. I can even bring up my name if I wanted to. And you know, looking at our other lives, they are very successful. Right? We can see that this one has almost 2.5 thousand views. We have a live chat that's happening and being moderated as well. Now, this is something that we really like, and we promote our smaller programs as well, because we want to make sure that we're reaching a general audience, but we're also reaching that small. And that's why we have those virtual classroom visits as well. Now, to start off and kind of bring it all back together is we just use our gimbal and our phone, and that's really all we needed. Now, the gimbal themselves, there are definitely different models, and they can get pretty expensive sometimes, especially the type of phone. But we're looking at around $150 for a gimbal, at least something that would be worth getting. And then the phone, depending on what you're getting, can range and vary the price itself. And a lot of this other tech does get a bit expensive too. But it really depends who you're communicating with and how you're trying to do that as well. So I'm going to pass it on back to Karen here, and she's going to take it away again.
Thanks, Will. So some of this has been mentioned in the previous presentations, but as you heard, people started to come out of hiding in the springtime, so to speak, as the temperatures warmed up and many people wanted to get outside and do something. And so our park saw an overwhelming number of visitors. And as you heard, some people had just never been to our parks before, so they didn't know the protocol, the etiquette, and there were a lot of issues like littering and dogs off leash. And so at CVC, we redeployed some seasonal staff as conservation interpreters to walk the trails and to be a more visible presence in CVC parks. Because of staffing changes due to the pandemic, we had these staff available. And over the course of their contract, they interacted with 22,660 people, where 8,000 of those interactions were a longer, deeper conversation. Staff picked up 230 bags of garbage, which was a daily activity. And they asked 930 people to come back on trail. They asked 145 dogs, not the dogs, but the owners of the dogs, to be put back on leash. And of course, they reminded people to be vigilant about social distancing while in our parks. As a result, our staff educated, interacted, and engaged with a wider and more diverse audience while improving the visitor experience. So when we were building this presentation with all of our colleagues, we wanted to come away with some general themes, and we thought, really, is technology and environmental education here to stay? And yeah, you know, before the pandemic, we were already using a variety of technology in the outdoors, teaching in the outdoors, like iPads and GPS units. But because of the pandemic, we have increased inclusivity and accessibility to our programs and services. And we hope that these approaches don't really replace an experience like an elementary student seeing a frog for the first time in a wetland. And we hope that new Canadians will take pride in CA parks and thus foster awe and wonder that leads to a sense of responsibility to steward the lands that we've been enacted to protect. And we know that technology can't really fully replace these experiences that spark a natural curiosity, but we're really excited about the opportunities that it's given us during the pandemic. By adapting and pivoting during the pandemic, I've said it again, pivoting, CA educators have assured watershed residents and community partners that we are here to support them in nature connection and learning. CA educators are broadening our reach to new audiences. We are strengthening our reputation as leaders in environmental and outdoor education. We continue to collaborate internally and externally with other professionals, and we're tapping into new revenue streams, setting us up for success post-pandemic. And of course, we're increasing the accessibility and inclusivity of our programs and services. Thank you so much for your time, and feel free to reach out to us and connect with us.
Thanks, Karen and William. William, we have a couple of quick questions before we open it up to the panelists. Just so participants know, we've now listed the software and some of the hardware that William was referring to in the chat session. One question that came in from Kristen, William, are you using your lapel microphone with just your phone?
So there are lapel mics in regards to a phone itself. So the lapel mic that I'm using right now can be used for both a larger speaker system and also a computer. A lapel mic that will be used for a phone is specific for a phone. There are ways to have adapters that will go into it, but there's a whole bunch of other complicated things in regards to now you're going to need to carry a battery pack, and you're probably going to have to wear a backpack for that. So there are lapel mics for phones themselves, and there are lapel mics for computers or stereo systems. They are separate, but you can't make them come together. The one I'm using is for my computer, and Zoom is actually hearing it. And then I have a different video feed from my phone here, which is going into Streamlabs, which then Zoom is seeing. So
I see it mentioned in the chat that Streamlabs is free. What do you think the kind of the base amount would be to get in on this in terms of the hardware that you would need?
Yeah, definitely. So the base amount, I would say for if you have a phone already, I would say the first place to start is just a gimbal in regards to, and I would probably go with Osmo. They are one of the leading brands in regards to, I don't work for them. I'm not advertising, and I'm not getting paid to say this, but they are one of the better gimbals out there for consumers, along with a lot of different other products that they create. So I would say you're looking at $250 or $200 for just a gimbal itself. And then, if that suits your needs, by all means, that's where you can kind of end it, right? Streamlabs is free. You can use your phone and go into that and use it as a webcam. But if you want to start, getting into more and more, it can range, some of the equipment here in front of me, I'd say we're looking around about $1,000 or $1,500 to $1,800 in regards to some of the equipment in front of me. Another great tool, the Zoomy, is about $70. They have gone up actually since COVID due to, the want and need for them too.
Great, thanks for the tips, William. I'm now going to ask all the other panelists to turn on their cameras, and I'll open it up to some of the questions that we've been receiving in the Q&A. The top rated question comes from John Chambers. Have your communication efforts been a blanket effort to reach the most people, or have you developed KPIs or ways to measure the effectiveness of messaging by type or platform? He references, are you changing it by time of day, of the week, etc.? That they typically post the same similar messages to all platforms, but the engagement is completely different depending on the messaging. And that question was first launched, I think, during Tori and John's presentation. So why don't we start with some feedback from Tori and John?
Sure, maybe I'll start it off, but I'm sure Hassan's going to have some comments on this, especially around those engagement surveys. I mean, John, like you mentioned, we are blanketing some of these responses. We're communicating, we're retailing our message, and a lot of the time we're bringing it back to those standard trail etiquette, conversations online. Something for us when we look at our insights that was super important for us was those links to web traffic. So when we're tracking our KPIs, for sure, impressions and area that counts, but something that we really focused in on was that information referral. So if we're sharing resources on our trails or on our programs, specifically when we talked about how was our tree planting program going to proceed in the spring, and we had some campaigns tailored around those messages, but what we were looking for was, who clicked on the link to the website. When they got to the website, did they download the tree order form? When they got to the recreation website, did they actually download the information to see which trails were open, right? So that's how we tried to measure our effectiveness. Were we actually getting people to that referral, that information that we thought that they wanted access to? Hassan, I don't know if you want to weigh in, especially with regards to surveys, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. And it's very similar to what you said. I mean, there are two types of communication here to look at. One is sort of, just the general cadence of marketing and engagement and promotional and educational and information stuff, both the corporate and the parks that goes out. And for that, our marketing team You know, I don't know how they do it. You feel free to call them, but they figured out which channels they want to use for what types of information. So, you know, Facebook they feel is really good for, you know, sort of parents and moms making decisions on what to do. You know, and so they use it for that kind of messaging. Instagram is great for that instant engagement around this broader brand and perception. Twitter is where you kind of go with your corporate type of messaging and more action oriented. But so they have channels, and then LinkedIn, you can throw that into the mix as well. And they use that, and so they almost never use the same messaging everywhere. And sometimes I'll see something doing really well on Instagram, and I'll, you know, text the marketing or comms, you know, lead and say, hey, we should just tweet that one out too, and they'll just come back to say, no. If you want this tweeted out, we'll tweet something out, but it won't be this, because they don't want to do that. So that's one. They look at the medium that they're using and the type of messaging. The other is around the surveys, and yeah, we learned a lot very quickly on sort of, you know, the most effective time to do a survey. And I don't know exactly what it was, but they settled on it had to be done within X hours or minutes of the visit ending to get the highest response. You know, so because initially they were kind of, you know, send them out the next morning, send them out at the end of the day, send them out in the evening, send them out while they were still in the park. And so they sort of did this A/B testing over the first 2 or 3 weeks, and you very quickly start to pick up some trends. And then and so there definitely is an art and a science both to doing surveys, both the question, how you ask them, and when you deploy them. But I'm not an expert on it. But I do know that our staff look at that to optimize it.
Just before we leave that topic, are any of you sharing this data with Conservation Ontario so that they have access to that data to argue the need for green spaces?
Well, CO, Elizabeth, as you know, does a survey every year where they ask for data on a whole bunch of stuff that we do in an organized fashion. So they all get it on a template at the same time, and then they use that for messaging. So, you know, once that comes across, we will be sharing it. But I think all CAs have been sharing how, you know, how the increase in visitation and the value that people have put on our conservation areas and our online education programs. That's been very much part of the messaging that's been coming out from CAs, and whether you're a small conservation authority, a big one, or a medium one, everybody's seen massive increases in park usage.
This question is from Stephanie. It's more for our outreach and education panelists. In the field of outreach and education, what activities have you found to be the most effective for families and people to do at home or in their backyard, as this type of outreach is more popular during this time? Karen?
Yeah, sure. I'll take it away. There's lots of different things that families can do, whether it's looking up on the education pages of different conservation authorities. There's some that are geared for elementary students, so a parent could read through that and adapt it. There's lots of other Facebook groups that are sharing ideas of ways to get outside and activities to do. Something as simple as making a bird feeder with their young family at home and posting it. I'm thinking social media, but putting it outside. There's that. There's connecting to other naturalist clubs to share information, citizen science activities that families can do at home, using a conservation authority education team or division as a hub to access local resources and local science. If they are looking for more technical information, they can tap into the science that CAs offer. Those are just a few ideas right now that we're using.
Any other panelists want to chime in on that question?
Sure. Yeah. One of the ones we've done, especially specifically with students or teachers in particular, is we'd go into the classroom virtually or create a video and then just have a little handout or an attachment to it to further their learning and try to get them to maybe explore their own little area around them. A big thing when we were talking about the development of all this is, for myself, right, I have a larger garden. Others may not have that opportunity, right? We've run into students who maybe live in an apartment, right? So we have to make sure that the development of these resources, if they're additionally in trying to engage with the members of the public or students themselves, that it's equitable and equal for everybody to have an opportunity. We did a little bio blitz almost with a class, and they had to find different things, or maybe if it's me holding the camera, they'd have to find 5 different things. We've tried lots of different things, and it's trying to figure out what works best for the clients or community members or teachers too, because everyone has a different threshold of what they're good with in regards to tech or what they have around them too.
I think you mentioned this, William, in your presentation, but are you reaching most of your viewers through YouTube?
Yeah. So Facebook was where we started, and we've actually transitioned through our live videos to YouTube and specifically targeting teachers and classrooms now. And we've had a lot of great success with that. We'd run it bi-weekly, and where we post our pre-recorded videos and other social media posts would be Facebook, Instagram, and then it would end up in YouTube. YouTube has a better way of categorizing or cataloging videos itself, right? And it has, playlists, whereas YouTube, it kind of gets lost in the Facebook realm of things. So it's a bit harder to find things there, and it's a bit easier on YouTube, we find.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Just a few things to wrap up. If we didn't have an opportunity to ask your question, I know all the panelists are certainly welcome to some follow-up by email or reaching out to them at their local CAs. This Latornell Leadership Project session has been brought to you by the Latornell Conferencing Steering Committee. I would like to thank all those who helped make this happen, including Janet Ivey, Chair of the Latornell Conference, Jamie Jodry, the conference program chair, Nikisha Mohammed, who's been busy typing answers for you in the chat, and Jane Lewington of Conservation Ontario, Dave Bray, Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, Mario and Karen from ALSAT Inc., who I couldn't have done this without you, the Latornell Conference organizers. The Latornell Conservation Symposium is on hiatus as we too reimagine our way of connecting with you in the new normal. This is my first year serving on the Latornell Steering Committee, and what has impressed me is how dedicated this group of people is to delivering the highest quality of professional development. This morning is just further proof that Latornell can also pivot to continue to bring Ontario conservationists together to talk about the big issues and to develop the collaborations that we need in order to find solutions. We're back after the Christmas break with our next webinar on Tuesday, January 19th. Solutions and action on diversity, equity, inclusion, and solutions and action on diversity, equity, inclusion, and racism in conservation. One more thing for you to do before you leave, can you please complete our last poll on the screening telling us how informative you felt this webinar was? And a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Latornell Symposium website for anyone to watch. Give us a couple of days to get it posted. Thank you again for taking the time to learn more about communicating through a pandemic. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.